March 18th, 2018, the book of 1 Samuel. I hope you've begun your reading of 1 Samuel and working your way through. As you know, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, really 1st, 2nd Chronicles are books of history of the nation of Israel. Sometimes we view them, we read them, we study them as just dry history, but we have to remember that there's a lot of meaning that's built into the history of Israel. And Israel's history is recorded in a very interesting way. We see their high points, we see their low points, we see the good things that they do, we see their many failures, the many evil things they do. We're admonished to study the history of Israel in the context of three potential levels of meaning or interpretation. Certainly one is the national level, what's going on in the nation of Israel, and it's important that we learn about that. But above that, we want to see the universal history or the universal interpretation or significance of what's going on in Israel, in that it really tells us something about what's going on in the world. And then at a level below that, at the individual level, we see the history of Israel portrayed in a certain way, but we know as the nation goes, so go the individuals, or vice versa. As the individuals go, so go the nation. So we see in 1 Samuel, it starts out really, the last verse of the book of Judges would be a suitable beginning to the book of Samuel. And what was the last verse of the book of Judges?
No king.
Yeah. In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so as we study the book of Samuel, what do we see in the very beginning? We see the degradation that has taken place in Israel, and we see specifically what's highlighted here is the corruption of the priesthood. We saw the introduction of the corruption of priesthood at the end of the book of Judges, as you recall, but we'll see here how this plays out. But we also see in the very beginning of the book of Samuel, we see the injection of hope. We see in the story of Hannah how her depression, she has a real desire in her heart. She really wants a child. She really wants a son. And so she prays earnestly for a son. She makes promises to the Lord, and a son is given to her in a very prophetic sense, in a very significant sense. So as I put up on the board a little bit of the history of where we are right now, we'll see the book of 1 Samuel covers only about 90 years of history. Contrast that to the book of Judges, which covered about a 300-year period of time in Israel history. And it doesn't encompass all of this, but just for context purposes, the first king of Israel was Saul, as we know. Saul and David and Solomon each reigned for about 40 years. These dates that I have up here are not exact, they're just approximations, but they're pretty good approximations. We're going to see in the book of 1 Samuel that Saul is anointed. He comes to power. He becomes the king about 1050 BC, and he dies at the very end of 1 Samuel. Saul is killed, and so that's a reign of about 40 years. At that time, David ascends the throne. He is often regarded as the greatest king of Israel. He ruled for 40 years, roughly 1000 BC, roughly 1010 to 970, and then when David dies, Solomon takes over 970, 930, and as we all know, during Solomon's reign, the temple is constructed. The temple is begun about 966 BC, and we have that very interesting account about it was exact a certain period of time after the Exodus, and so we see that there's some significance to God's timing. One of the themes that I think permeates the book of Samuel that I want us to think about is that every aspect of life is permeated by a divine plan. Too many people these days think that life is just a series of random occurrences, and it can be. It can be a series of good, it can be a series of tragic occurrences, but one of the things that God wants us to recognize is that every aspect of our lives is permeated by His divine plan. And from the beginning of time until Christ returns, life is going to be about what we do to seek to conform our lives to God's plan. And the more we resist that, the more difficult life is going to be, the more we get focused on changing our life and making it our principal desire that His will be done, that we live our lives in accordance with His plan and purpose. That's when our lives get to be better, only when we do that. And so we see in the book of Samuel, in the very beginning, we once again have presented to us a story of dichotomies. How many times do we have the dichotomy of the two sons? Here we have a dichotomy in the very beginning of the two wives. And typically when we have these two, the two sons laid side by side, Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Ishmael, what do they represent?
Child of the flesh and
Yeah.
child of the spirit.
Spirit, yeah, the spirit in contrast to the flesh. And we see that, I think, again, portrayed here.
Cain and Abel.
Was that?
Cain and Abel.
Exactly, yeah, exactly the same thing. And so we see that, I think, portrayed once again here in the beginning of 1 Samuel. So let's read about it, and then we'll talk about it in particular. Terry, why don't we start with you, if you're open and ready to read.
Okay.
1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1.
There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zephite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jehoram, the son of Eliud, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuk, and Ephraimite.
Now, pause right there just a second. So we have an introduction to this guy. He's of the tribe of Ephraim, and his name is Elkanah. I made myself a note from an earlier study, a reference back to 1 Chronicles chapter 6. Does anybody have that same reference? If you don't, make yourself a note there, because there's something interesting there. First Chronicles chapter 6, starting around verse 33. First Chronicles.
33? You said 27 and 34 is what mine.
Yes, it really starts about 27. First Chronicles chapter 6.
27 and 34?
Yeah, if you look, First Chronicles chapter 6, actually, if you go to, starting with about verse 31, let me just read it. It says, Now these are those whom David appointed over the service of song in the house of the Lord after the ark rested there. So this is about King David, in other words, a later period of time, and those that David appointed as basically music ministers, if you will. And it says, And they ministered with song before the tabernacle of the tent of meeting until Solomon had built the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. And they served in their officer according to the order. And these are those who served with their sons. For the sons of the Kohathites were Herman the singer. Herman the singer. I guess that's like Herman the Hermits, right? Herman the singer, the son of Joel, the son of Samuel. Look at that. And is that our Samuel? Yes, it is. Samuel, the son of Elkanah. And then we have the same lineage that Terry just read to us, the son of Jeroham, the son of Eliel, the son of Toh, the son of Zuph. Okay, then it goes on even further. Okay, so we see that Samuel's grandson was a singer in David's court. And then if you also look down to verse 39, it says, And Herman's brother Asaph stood at his right hand, even Asaph the son of Berechiah, the son of Shemaiah. Now, who is Asaph? If you remember your book of Psalms, you're going to see that in Psalms, at virtually every chapter of Psalms, there's a reference to who the author was. Many were authored by David, as we know, but you're going to see that at least a dozen of them are attributed to this guy, Asaph. So Asaph, who was a brother, I don't know if he was a blood brother, but he's called the brother of Herman. Herman was the music minister who was the grandson of Samuel. So an interesting lineage there. But I just pointed out.
Associate.
Say again?
My verse 39 says associate.
Mm-hmm. I think it must have been just like a brother in spirit, not really a blood brother, because it looks like he's got a different lineage. But anyway, they were.
One was from the Gershonites and one from the
Kohathites, yeah. Two out of three tribes of Levi, whose task was to deal with the various implements of the tabernacle. Right?
But find that odd that they said they're an Ephraimite, but they're also Levites.
Well, but remember that Levites, that is interesting, but remember, at the time that the promised land was settled, we had the Levites that they were actually stationed in, there was one in just about every tribe.
Right.
So, but yeah, you'd have thought he might have been called a Levite rather than an Ephraimite, but it's unusual. Of course, some unusual things have happened at those times. Okay, Terry, read on, verse 2.
He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah.
Penina, I think.
Peninnah
Uh-huh.
had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of meat to his wife, Phinehas, and to all her sons and daughters. But Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. When Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her until she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?
All right, pause right there. So here we have the sort of the.
He fought a lot of himself.
What's that?
He fought a lot of himself.
He did. He said, better than 10 sons. Yeah, I mean, obviously he's trying to comfort her, right? But maybe not in the best way. But here we have this man who appears to be an upright man. He's got 2 wives. So, polygamy at this point in time was not something that was necessarily condemned. One of his wives had children. One of them was barren. And it's interesting that what is said of the barren wife Hannah is that what?
That's the one that whose husband loved her.
Yeah. Her husband loved her, but also it said that God had closed her womb. Interesting, and why would you think God would do that? And the fact that she had no children was a cause of great concern to her. She wept bitterly. She felt like she had been deprived. What do you think is going on in Hannah's mind at this point in time? She's obviously being provoked by the other wife, and the other wife is really making her life more miserable. And how so?
Well, I think she probably feels that she's not as worthy, or, the value was if you had children, wasn't it? I mean,
That's right.
with the lineage and stuff like that, so she was probably pretty sorry for herself, and then being reminded of it constantly doesn't make it better.
Yeah.
And I would imagine she really wondered about her husband, because, I guess they all wanted to carry on a lineage. And if you couldn't give them children, how long would he love you? I don't know. I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And also in that time, wouldn't it be that she was cursed by God?
Yeah, that's kind of what the general consensus was, that if you were a married woman and you didn't produce children, that God doesn't think much of you. He's cursing you because of this. But yes, she felt very inferior. The other one, she was full of pride, and she constantly was reminding this other woman that, oh, I've got children and you don't. God closed your womb. God doesn't love you. God obviously loves me. He's prospered me.
Didn't Hagar tease Sarah or something like that?
Yeah, she did. And I think
Must
there's
be.
some jealousy there
Yeah.
between the 2 women, because the one who has all the children knows that her husband loves this other woman more than he loves her.
Yeah, yeah,
Despite her ability to produce children.
yeah. Do you think that these 2 women, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, that they represent in some sense the flesh and the spirit? And it's pretty easy to see which one represents what. I think in some sense this also is an allegory or a representation of what's going on in Israel at the time. Now, in what sense would you say these 2 women represent Israel, what Israel had become? Which one represents the greater part of what Israel had become?
Hannah.
No, I
But
think
she's-
the one with the children, because she's prideful and doing
Yeah, she's prideful, she's doing her own thing. She is the woman after the flesh.
Right.
Hannah is the one after the spirit, and she's kind of the loner. She's almost the lone voice, right? She is the one who ultimately cries out to God that God would answer her prayer and bring about something good, okay? There's no doubt that the birth of Samuel was something good. Samuel was certainly a great spiritual gift to the nation of Israel, wasn't he? Yeah. Okay, read on. Kim, you want to read next?
9.
9.
Okay. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you would only look upon me, upon your servant misery, and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head.
All right, pause right there a second. Her vow that no razor would ever be used on his head indicates what?
That's
The
right.
Nazarite.
Yeah, the Nazarite vow. And it's interesting, again, that just like in the case of Samson, that it is the mother who made the Nazarite vow for the purpose or for the benefit of the son. And we know back then, having studied the book of Leviticus, how if one undertook the Nazarite vow, it was not intended to be something perpetual, although in the case of Samuel, it did appear to be a perpetual lifestyle, that he lived the life of the Nazarite the entirety of his life. But also, we recall in the book of Leviticus that if someone were seeking something miraculous from God, they would frequently make a vow of this sort, right? And when they did that, it was very important that they kept the vow.
Yeah, I mean, that's a serious vow, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you were looking for a child.
To give a
then
child.
What would the weaning age be?
Yeah.
A couple years old? I mean,
2, 3,
yeah.
3, 4
I mean,
years
then
old.
to give up, wow.
Yeah, so she
She
was.
kept it.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. And it's interesting here that this is obviously all a part of God's plan. It was always a part of God's plan that He would send Samuel. Samuel was a prophet, but also Samuel was probably the last of the judges, right? Samuel was it is said of him that he was a prophet, which he certainly was, that he was a priest, which he certainly was, and even though he wasn't a king, he was certainly a kingmaker, wasn't he? He anointed 2 kings. And so it is said of him that the office that Samuel filled was never filled again until Christ came as prophet, priest, and king.
Then they say that, the word of the Lord was not spoken much at that time, and
That's
so he
right.
was really the first time God had put somebody as, like say, a prophet or
Yeah.
in place in quite a few years.
Yeah. Don't you find it interesting the way God worked through Hannah's life to bring about this great event in Israel's life? How does it start off? He starts off by closing Hannah's womb, something that for all intents and purposes, people would think that she's cursed by God, but actually she has been selected by God for a very, very important purpose, to be the mother of one of the greatest prophets that Israel ever knew. And so what happens? God closes her womb, brings her to the point of desperation, and then she cries out to the Lord. You can just feel the anguish in her prayer, that she just, with all of her heart and all of her soul, she's imploring God, please hear my prayer, please answer my prayer. And when that happens, God answers those types of prayers, those real heartfelt prayers that come from the very depth of one's soul. And she has a desire for something. She doesn't know what she has a desire for, but God answers her prayer. Okay, where we leave? Keep on reading, Kim. Verse 12. Yeah.
As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine.
All right, pause right there. This is something that tells us, I think, really how far the priesthood had degraded at that time. That Eli was so out of touch that he couldn't discern the difference between a woman who was pouring her heart out to God and some drunk who was right there at the door of the tabernacle. So, he was not spiritually perceptive at all. He really couldn't see what was going on in Hannah's life. Read on.
Do you think they had lots of drugs at the tabernacle?
I
Yeah, I don't
suspect
think
they
it's
did.
uncommon.
And you can see later on, based upon what Eli's two sons were doing at the outer courts, that there's probably a lot of lascivious,
Corruption.
a lot of corruption out there going on that they didn't do anything about, and even it appears that they promoted that. Okay, read on.
Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer, but pouring out my soul. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked him of. She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. And she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast.
You know, it's interesting about this encounter. You can just visualize Hannah there. She's pouring her heart out to the Lord. You know, it was a very emotional time for her. She's pleading with God. And Eli comes up. He doesn't know what's going on. The first thing he does is rebuke her. You drunk, get out of here. And it's very interesting. Her response, she's respectful, but she is very much in his face, isn't she? She says, you know, sir, you have no idea what's going on here. I'm not drunk. I'm not close to being drunk. I'm coming and I'm bringing my prayer to the Lord. He says, I've spoken out of great concern and provocation. Don't think of me as a worthless woman.
When I read this, I think of him like he was giving her a blessing, and he says, may your wish be granted or something like that. But now I realize it's just probably was just saying it as common, okay, have a good day type of thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
nothing, no.
But it's interesting that even here, as corrupt as Eli was, I think God is working through him, because I think the word that Eli gives to Hannah is a word of encouragement to her, and basically it's told her, hey, your life has changed. You know, that God has heard your prayer, He has seen your desperate condition, and God is going to answer your prayer. So I think that's a sign from God that, you know, again, showing that God does, He even works through the corrupt. All right, verse 19. Kathy, you want to read?
I'll pass.
Kenny?
Yes. Early the next morning, they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always.
Pause right there for a second. This is the second time it talks about Elkanah going up once a year to make his sacrifice and his vow. Now, what do we know? What command did God give to the people about appearing before the tabernacle and observing festivals?
Was it once a year or something?
No, it's supposed to be 3 times a
3
year.
times?
There was 3 national festivals that they were to observe by pilgrimage to the tabernacle. But you can see here, he was only going up once. Now, I don't think that Elkanah was doing this as an act of sin or denying God's law. I think he just hadn't been taught God's law by the priests. I think the priests had not been diligent in teaching
Where is Hannah when she's praying? Is she inside the temple because women weren't allowed?
Yeah, because he's by the doorpost.
Yeah, I get the impression that, so it would have been, this is the tabernacle that's set up. It's my impression that she probably would have been around here. This is where a lot of funny business is going on. You know, we're going to
And
read later
so
on.
Eli would have been out there?
He was at the gate.
Eli probably would have been at the gate, and he probably would have been just kind of watching, to see what's going on. He was probably watching to see who was going to bring, what in, so he could, get his first dibs on the good stuff, because that's what he and his son were doing at the time. Whenever these offerings were brought in, he wanted the choicest stuff for himself. So I think that's what was going on there, where that was going on. And the tabernacle at the time was set up where? Shiloh, that's right. Let's see, Shiloh on a map.
Yes.
Above Jerusalem.
Yes, north of Jerusalem. see it
to the
here.
north,
It's an
a little
Ephraim.
piece of
It's-
the northeast.
Yeah.
Jerusalem, Ramah,
It's
and
not here,
Shiloh.
yeah, right.
It's about,
It's
it's
near
about
the purple.
halfway in
The
in
green.
the country of,
Ephraim?
in Ephraim.
Okay, all right.
It's over to the,
North of Oprah.
to the eastern corner.
Right in this area here?
Yeah, Oprah's
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
Yep, yep.
All right. So that's where it was. All right, read on, Brother Kenny.
Do what seems best to you, Elkanah, her husband told her. Stay here until you have weaned him, only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. And she said to him, As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him, so that I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there.
That was a very difficult thing that Hannah did, didn't she? I mean, you know, she poured out her heart before the Lord. She wanted a son. She promised that she would dedicate him. She gets the son, and she proves to be a woman of integrity, a woman of her word. Yes, ma'am?
She probably, did she go by herself, or you think? Or had servants, I guess, huh? Because her husband didn't go with her.
Yeah, I
Because
don't
he went up to worship
I
and
wonder
he
if-
came back.
Yeah, I wonder if this is a common practice, like they would bring children to serve at the temple, or is this unusual?
I think it's an unusual thing. Well, I think it's an unusual thing in the sense that he was not just a boy who was going to work there and go home in the evening. He basically, he went there to live. You know, he camped out. He's living within.
I mean, he took him in,
Tabernacle.
that's why I was wondering.
He took him in, that's right. Again, the divine work of God, I
Yes,
think.
yes.
But don't you know, it was a difficult thing for Hannah to leave him there that day.
And for
This little
Samuel.
boy.
was the child?
And for Samuel too.
So he had to be older. You were asking his age. He had to be over. He had to be able
5,
to.
7.
Probably 3 or 4 said he was after he was weaned.
I know, but to be able to do on his own, I mean, you can't expect Eli to take care
Well,
of
that's
him.
true.
Yeah. But he was a youngster.
Yes.
He was a little guy. He wasn't shaving yet, I don't think.
Maybe like 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Imagine what the rest of the people thought of Hannah though, after
Samuel.
yearning for this child.
Yeah.
And then to give him away, like, well, maybe you were never supposed to have that child to begin with, you gave him away, you know.
Yeah.
But her commitment and her
Yes.
belief in the Lord, didn't matter what anyone would say, she would follow what she had promised
Yeah.
to do.
Incredible.
I mean, I think Hannah is a tremendous example of faith and commitment, because after she does that, it doesn't say that she wept and she became a recluse. Chapter 2, it's her song of thanksgiving. So she gives thanks to the Lord. She pours out her heart before the Lord again, but once again with thanksgiving, and we'll see that there's a lot of prophecy in her song. I don't know if you caught that as you read through it. But Wanda, would you read that? Would you read Hannah's song of thanksgiving for us, starting in chapter 2?
Then Hannah prayed and said, My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted up high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance.
All right, pause right there just a second. She says, my mouth speaks boldly against my enemies. Who's she referring to there?
Her sister-in-law. I mean, her.
Her co-wife.
Her co-wife, I'm sorry.
That's
Whatever
right.
you call her.
She says, my mouth speaks.
Competition.
That's right, her competition. She says, my horn is exalted. The horn is a reference to what?
Strength.
Her strength, that's right. So she's feeling strong now. Once again, she was feeling very weak when she couldn't conceive or give birth, but now she's feeling
Yes.
God's strength within her.
When Jericho was taken, the horn was lifted and blown.
That's right, that's right.
The trumpet, the horn.
Pronouncing the strength, that's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. All right, read on. And she's rejoicing in her salvation. She believes that in her encounter with God that she has been saved. A very interesting thing. She's poured out her heart to God. God has answered her prayer, and now she's experiencing His salvation.
But don't we all feel joy and unbelievable joy when God answers our prayers, when we
Yeah.
pray for something and then we are just so
Yeah,
filled.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing how fast you can forget
To allow
or take
it
it
to
for
be-
granted?
Yeah.
He allows us to be a part of it, to see this.
That's right. And that's why, what Jack said, that is, and Lon said, it is so important that when we pray and God answers our prayer, it's important that we give thanks and we rejoice, but we share that with others too, with other Christians. You know, don't cast your pearls before swine, but certainly among your Christian brothers and sisters, let them know that I prayed and God answered my prayer, because I think that's something that lifts us all up, doesn't it? Verse 2.
There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry hunger no more.
Pause right there. Who's she referring to there? Those who are hungry hunger no more.
Anyone seeking God, I
Yeah.
guess.
Particularly herself.
Yeah.
You know, she was very hungry, but God has fed her. Okay.
She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away.
Pause right there. Who's she referring to there?
Penina.
Yeah. Nina, her, obviously, she who has many languages, but she says even the barren gives birth to 7.
So she wrote this quite a bit later because now she has 7 children?
Yeah.
Evidently.
It's recorded that in verse 21 it says, and the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. So that's 5 plus Samuel, that's 6. But she says she has 7. Who's the 7th?
Her husband.
No, he's 10.
That's a good question.
The 7th, I think, is the legacy, the promise of the Messiah coming. I think she's counting the Messiah as her 7th son because God is working through her. Now, she's not in the lineage of Christ, but certainly Samuel played a great part. He was the one who anointed David, who was the great grandfather of Christ. And so I think she's counting herself in. But can't you just hear the confidence that she's bringing about right now? And can't you just, you contrast Hannah, this lowly, barren woman who is regarded as the outcast of God. You contrast her to Eli the priest, and she is speaking more wisdom and more truth. And she is such a much more powerful voice in Israel than Eli or his sons were at the time. Read on.
The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. Upon them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked will be silenced in darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest.
Wow, what a
So
power.
Elkanah was with them.
Yeah, that's what that
Yeah.
says.
Look at those last 2 things she says. That the Lord will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. In those days there was no king in Israel, but she's talking about said that he will give strength to his king. So when the king is named that God has selected, God will give him strength. And he also says he will exalt the horn or the strength of his anointed. Who is his anointed? Ultimately, that's right. I think Hannah here is referring to not just, when she says the king, I think she's talking about King David. But when she says his anointed, I think she's talking about Christ, whom again she claims as one of her 7 children, I believe. Okay, other comments about that? What a beautiful song that is, though. And what a,
Spiritual insight.
she really has. She's been given tremendous spiritual insight, and you can see that God is really with her. Again, she's making more spiritual pronouncements than Eli does. that are ever recorded here. So, you know, it's amazing how God works through those whom the world would view as loathing, that's right, or condemned or cursed. Okay. Jackie, would you pick up in verse 12?
Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was still being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with a three-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest the meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. If the man said to him, 'Let the fat be burned up first, and then take whatever you want,' the servant would then answer, 'No, hand it over now. If you don't, I will take it by force.' This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight. So they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But
Right.
sin,
Pause right there just a second. We can see here how deeply the priesthood had degraded. What was going on at this time? What was so reprehensible about what these priests were doing?
Abusing their power, holding it as over the people. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, they were victimizing them basically in the name of the Lord.
Yeah.
Like,
And
we're priests, so we
they
can do
wasn't
this.
humble.
No, they
They
weren't
were
humble.
taking for themselves what should have been the Lord's.
Exactly. So they're robbing God, right? But the other thing they're doing to the people is the people resented them. Why? Because the people were bringing these offerings for what purposes? Because God told them to, right? But they were doing it for the purpose of what?
Sacrificing it to the Lord.
That's right, for atonement of their sins.
Right,
That's right, that's right. So it was part of what, you know, they came bearing the burden of sin, and they knew that God had promised that if you bring these sacrifices, that your sins would be forgiven. And it's as if these priests were taking away that privilege that God had given to them. Right? In other words, their sins were not being forgiven. Why? Because the offerings that they brought were being corrupted or taken away from them. So what was going on in the priesthood was just a totally reprehensible thing.
They was doing what we just said, the end of Judges, whatever was right in their own eyes, whatever they wanted, they was big enough to do.
That's it.
And then like Lon said, it was abusing the power that they was given.
Yeah.
So therefore the people suffered because of the priest's sins?
Yes, they did. I think they did.
Well, I don't know, God's intent, they understands their hearts.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if they stole the meat, by them bringing it, God recognizes their effort. I mean, I don't think.
I think he does with the sincerity of it, but the problem is that these priests were setting such bad examples that the people were being led astray.
So it's just a trickle down effect.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. The trickle down effect that they were no longer to think, well, hey, you know, if the priests don't think it's important that I bring the best, you know, I'll bring the rotten banana instead of the best. You know, I'll bring the three-legged bull
he's gonna
instead of
take it anyway.
the
Yeah, because
imperfect,
the
right?
priests are taking it, it's
That's
not
right.
going to the Lord.
well, don't we suffer because of bad leadership?
We did.
Yes.
It's interesting too, it says they was doing what became custom.
Yeah.
It wasn't a right God gave them, it was a custom that they, you know.
All right, Lon, pick up verse 18, please.
But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Achan and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give your children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance of the tent of the meeting.
Pause right there. So we see that they're even worse than we thought before. You know, I don't know exactly what the women were doing there, but I don't think they came there for illicit purposes. I think they came and they were forced into, you know, these immoral activities by the sons just because of their own lust.
Well, that's where Hannah was.
Yeah, right.
Were women allowed into the temple area?
You know-
Maybe that's as close as they could go. I don't know. I'm asking.
I don't know I don't believe they were allowed inside of the courtyard there.
So that might be.
Whenever one was built, in the Bible study we had, they could only go to the steps, remember?
Yeah,
So maybe that's.
yeah.
where
And then you remember even with the temple, they had the court of women at the time, Jesus court of women, and court of Gentiles, and that they could not go to the other places. So I don't believe that they were allowed in. All right, keep going.
So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons," he reported, "I hear spending among the Lord's people is not good. Spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for this offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them? His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and his people."
Pause right there. That verse 26, what does that sound like? Now, the boy
6 or
Samuel
5.
was growing,
Oh.
in verse 26, he was growing in stature and in favor with both the Lord and with men.
Sounds like what was said of Jesus.
Exactly. That's in Luke chapter 2, verse 52. The same thing was said of him after he was a young man. So here we have Samuel being portrayed sort of as a type of Christ, if you will, as a deliverer of Israel. Troy, you want to pick up there, verse 27?
I think I'll pass.
All right.
Yeah, I'm a fast too.
Sarah, read it fast.
Now,